voice is a little pollen voice. That sounds a little somewhere between a cross between Marilyn Monroe singing Happy Birthday to John Kennedy and Clint Eastwood saying Make My Day. Somewhere in there. So I may have to stop and drink a bit. Water. I think it's water. I put water in. So, our last evening together. I want to wish you a good evening. All you selves and not selves and everything in between. You probably haven't forgotten that we are ending tomorrow and that there is a world out there that's going on. And so tonight, I'm going to be talking about Bodhichitta, and I'm going to explain what that is throughout the talk. But there's an arc in the talk. And the arc of the talk, you may experience the beginning parts, some of the beginning parts of it is unpleasant. And you know what to do with that because you practiced it a little bit today. And then parts of it later will be probably more pleasant for most of you. So just hang in there with me. So we're gonna the arc of the talk tonight. We're gonna look at some of the energies that are driving the forces in the world, and then we're gonna move into a prescription for those energies. And I thought I'd start with a appropriate New Yorker cartoon that I found today in my notes. It's a couple sitting on a couch together. They look very happy. They're smiling. Guy's got a drink in his hand, and the TV is on the big flat screen. And the TV is saying this: this week on the amazing race to enlightenment, can Jim and Susie achieve right mindfulness? And will Barb and Candy be eliminated for relentless clinging to the self? And for those of you out there named Barb or Barbara, so we've talked a lot this week about this sense of self, the construct of, the solidification of. And we've explored the sense of separation that creates. And with this mental construction of self, that I'm a separate individual, when that's firmly embedded, there is naturally, and we've also talked about this, a sense of competition with others for resources. There's a sense of needing to defend this, protect it. You know, it's an embattled, separate, solid self. So it's not a great leap to see how an embedded construct like that and the tendencies that go along with it that we witness playing out in ourselves, they play out collectively. And we all have numbers of identities that we feel that we collectively belong to. I mean, I identify as a man, not a woman. I identify as white, not a person of color. I identify as Irish American as opposed to Italian American. Heterosexual. You know, it could be, we could go on and on, each of us. describing all the collective identities that we can assign ourselves to. There's a history, a patriarchal history. We can look historically at patriarchy. Historically, men banded together in a collective identity, created institutions and wrote laws that defined themselves as somehow superior. And over time, the laws were written that gave men power over women and their bodies, the right to control them. It's not just in this country, but in many places in the world. It became a man's right. That collective identity created it. Racism is the same. One group forming a separate identity, developing some significant level of hatred and fear to another, and then exploiting, oppressing them at will by virtue of the power that they've collected. You can say it's the same with nationalism. And it's easy from any vantage point, when a collective identity forms, coalesces power, then if they choose another group to single out and oppress and exploit, could be due to ethnicity, religion, gender, class, sexual orientation, disability. Sadly, it's kind of a long list. But whatever examples that you might choose and run the thread to, where there's exploitation of one group over another, when you deconstruct the underlying cause of that, it's always the same. It's the creation of the other. That's the offshoot of the creation of the separate, solid self. Oftentimes I'll read the news, or I'll look at the news, and I'll just notice how it's played out all over the world. One group declaring another group the other, finding ways to demonize them more and more, lessen their human value, and then the gates are open to do whatever you want. This talk's going to get brighter, so hang in there. I mean, this is the etymology of genocide, ethnic cleansing, torture, all forms of exploitation and discrimination. It's unfortunately a major thread in human history. It's not the only thread, though, however. And so I've been thinking about some of the cultural institutions here in America. And for one, the for-profit corporation, of which I've been involved in for my business life, maybe a dozen different corporations, and they're now ruled a person by the court. Not a very personal person, but a person nonetheless by our legal system. And generally, it's not the kind of person you'd want as a neighbor next door. The corporation has a very strong in-group identity. And the CEO of a corporation and the other officers, and actually everyone who works in the corporation, has a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders to create profit, and they can be held accountable if he or she chooses, say, social responsibility or the environment over profit. It's in the charter of all corporations. Their position at the particular business can be in danger. So even if the motivations of the individual in that particular organization are concern about the environment, concern about the effect of the corporation in the community of which it is, they know that they need to be careful in how outspoken they are or how they guide that corporation, because their fiduciary responsibility is to the stockholders and profit and nothing else. Corporations are designed by charter, and this is mostly all over the world, to preserve and increase their own power and perpetuate themselves. And that's quite apart from the motivations of the people, many of the people who work there. Most of them. Decent, good people, doing the best they can. John Ralston Saul, in a piece about the ethics of modern organizations, he says this. He defines amorality. He says, amorality is a quality admired and rewarded in modern organizations when it is referred to through metaphors such as professionalism and efficiency. Immorality is doing wrong of our own volition. We know it is unethical, but go ahead and do it anyway. Amorality is doing it because an organization or a structure expects us to do it. Amorality is therefore worse than immorality because it involves denying our responsibility, and therefore denies our existence as anything more than a cog in a machine or a being without the capacity to think. If you think back to the Nuremberg trials after World War II, or the more recent trials at The Hague, war crimes trials, every defense makes the plea, look, we were only following orders. That goes for individuals working in corporations that have been called on the carpet, so to speak, for various financial operations or polluting the environment. We're only following orders. It was the culture. It was expected of me. It's how we did things. There's a disconnect there. There's no responsibility. And the Buddha addressed this, and he called them the three poisons. They've been mentioned this week. The three poisons are greed, ill will, and delusion. They're also known as the three unwholesome motivations. The Buddha said that when we're motivated by any of these, that it's going to cause harm to ourselves and harm to everybody around us. And that's why it's a foundational part of a spiritual path, a bona fide spiritual path, not just this one, that instead of greed, there's a cultivation of generosity. Instead of ill will, there's a cultivation of loving kindness. Instead of delusion, there's a cultivation of wisdom. Especially the wisdom that helps us become more aware of our interdependence. Now, it logically follows that because greed, ill will, delusion hasn't been worked through in the individual in a societal structure, that those unskillful tendencies and motivations, they manifest themselves just directly in the institutions and systems that are established by those individual units. It makes sense. If we're struggling with those issues, anything we create is going to embed them in there. It's cause and effect. It's that simple. It's actually unavoidable. And so you can make a pretty good case that our main cultural institutions have taken on a life of their own and manifest these three poisons. And it's not just our country either. You can argue any of these points, and I may be offline here, but an argument can be made that we have institutionalized greed, our economic system. We have institutionalized ill will, which manifests itself as militarism, racism, as a kind of punishment for people who break laws, or the punishment for illegal immigrants, or as our attitude towards people with a different sexual orientation, Although that's changing, of course. And institutional delusion, we can see that manifested in the media and in our educational system. Our media is mostly unquestioning on what I think is the major question pertaining to species survival. Not just us, but all species. And the question is it really possible to have an economic system totally predicated on endless exponential expansion? Is that possible? Where in nature does that work? Where in nature does an exponential use of resources end well? So the belief that economies must expand exponentially forever, it seems to fly in the face of common sense. It worked for a while, but there are 7 billion of us, and this is a finite planet in terms of resources. You might call that delusional. And it doesn't get much play in the media. And sadly, the educational system doesn't do much critical questioning either. It's pretty much involved with just giving us the skills to assist this to continue. So not only is it important to investigate our own greed, ill will, and delusion, but to consider also how to work with this institutionalized greed, ill will, and delusion. I mean, being a citizen requires it in some way to come to grips with this. So now we're going to get to the good part. This week, what you've been practicing is the antidote to the energy of these 3 poisons. And in the situation of which we will be moving into tomorrow after this retreat, never forget the long view, the geologic view, the important characteristic of existence, and that's impermanence. Nothing is permanent. Not evenly the most seemingly all-powerful and self-perpetuating systems, institutions, prejudices, and poisons that I just laid out. They are not permanent. Impermanence is our friend in certain situations, actually in all situations. I remember being in Israel a few years ago, and there's a place called Megiddo. It's actually in maybe someplace in the Old Testament says that's where the world is going to end, whatever. But it's a very interesting place. Michener wrote about it. That was his book, I think, The Source. So it was the summertime. It was really hot. It was about 110 degrees or so. And no one lives in Megiddo now in that area. It's just a place of an archaeological dig that's been going on for over 100 years. Different archaeologists from different parts of the world, and there's usually a couple groups there. So on that particular day, they had set up their shade tarps, and they were working away, and everything was really slow. It was so hot. So get to hang out with them, just sit down with them and talk. And so over the years, and I found it so fascinating, they had made their way down through 21 different civilizations. And I was thinking, all those people in those different civilizations thought, well, we kind of have it together. It's going to keep going. Why not? I can't envision it not. Well, one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. That's the long picture. It's just fascinating to contemplate that. So you have at your personal disposal, and we have at our collective disposal, this transformational power called Bodhichitta. The word Bodhi means awakened, and Chitta has several meanings. Heart-mind is one that we've used before. Also, Chitta could mean thought, or spirit, or intention. So Bodhicitta is the awakening of the heart-mind, or the attitude of awakening, the intention of awakening. It's a vision of your life, that your life becomes so saturated that you want to live it in a different way. And in the meetings with many of you, I kind of felt that bursting forth. Those wholesome desires that bubble and froth up. That's bodhicitta. It's an altruistic energy. It's really an energy that it's a path of love and concern for others. Everything in this biosphere. It's a desire to be a benefit to others at all times. That's bodhicitta. It's a desire to live a life that's wakeful, alert, and that constantly unfolds with greater understanding and love. So we'll get into this bodhicitta a little deeper now. And sometimes it's parsed out as relative bodhicitta and absolute bodhicitta. On the relative level, the kind of moment-to-moment rubber meets the road level, bodhicitta means compassion. And on the absolute level, it means the empty nature of the mind itself. And one of the most interesting features that's been talked about throughout history, the history of Buddhism, and Chaz and Sharon have talked about it, is this relationship between dukkha and anatta. The relationship between unsatisfactoriness or stress and this selfless, this sense of not self or selflessness. Now, it's the most enigmatic, challenging concept in Eastern philosophy, this sense, this not self. But another way to frame anatta, or selflessness, that claim of not self, it's the claim that there is no separation. Anatta, no separation. Everybody see the cloud in this piece of paper? You got it? Okay, good. If you don't get it, it's like, where does this paper come from? Trees. Trees need soil, sun, moisture. Where does the moisture come from? It comes from rain. Where does rain come from? It comes from a cloud. Now it's obvious that the cloud is here. Look at the cloud. And it's in a way, it's implied that this piece of paper has interbeing with the cloud. It wouldn't be possible without the cloud. But not only the cloud, but all kinds of other things. If we let our mind follow the different threads that create this piece of paper. We mentioned the sun. We could have mentioned the lumberjack or the lumberjill or whoever cut the tree down. And we could also mention all the people that took care of them and educated them and taught them how to use the equipment, and the doctors that cared for them as they grew up, and the whole deal. And we could talk about the designing of the chainsaw, and all the equipment that was used and all the engineers involved and all the thinking and trial and error that went into that and all the materials that were mined and brought together in certain forms to make it work. And we could talk about the oil and gas that made it ran and all those that makes it run and all those creatures that were alive that make up our oil that then we process and use. So once you start reflecting on this incredible set of causes and conditions, it's just necessary to make a piece of paper. You start to see how everything is interdependent. Where do we get off thinking we're separate? And when we take it in and look at ourselves, it's incredibly true of all of you, the same as this piece of paper. You've got your parents, your great-grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., all the way back to those apes that came out of the trees and walked around the savannah and then kind of wormed their way all around this planet, our ancestors, our common ancestors. And if you take it back even further, trace the tree back to the original cell that was formed somewhere in the ocean, we think. And in order to have that, you've got to have these elements, calcium, nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, etc. In order to have those elements, we had to have fusion happening. This incredible power that kind of spread this stuff throughout the universe. And then to have the basic element of hydrogen and the plasma forming, there's the Big Bang. So there's an infinite connection to everything. It's not that's just that your mom and dad one night got down and did the dirty, This just goes on and on and on. So each and every one of you is a manifestation of the whole cosmos. It's literally true. It's not a fantasy that we're all from stardust. That concept of Indra's net, that three-dimensional net that is a metaphor for the whole cosmos. And at each intersection of the net is a jewel that reflects all the other jewels in the net. This world, this cosmos, is constructed out of all this phenomena that is reflecting everything else. Everything is affecting everything else. There's nothing outside this net. Some people will say, well, there's a God outside this net that makes it all happen. Who knows? But maybe not. And the difference between nirvana and samsara, heaven and hell, is the difference between delusion and enlightenment. It's whether some of these nodes on the net, us, the little nodes on the net, have a sense of separation, which is delusion. Or whether there is a realization or a growing realization that everything is simply reflecting everything else. This incredible interdependence points to emptiness. Now, it's not some kind of depressed, washed out, dull, gray vacuum emptiness, but empty of a separate, independent self. Empty of a separate, independent self. All of this is connected. You can't be separate. It's delusion when we feel that. From the Tibetan teacher, Shabkar. And just kind of close your eyes and feel into this. The mind's nature is vivid as a flawless piece of crystal. intrinsically empty, naturally radiant, and ceaselessly responsive. The mind's nature is vivid as a flawless piece of crystal. Intrinsically empty, naturally radiant, and ceaselessly responsive. Maybe you can begin to feel that. Let's do a reflection here. So, bring yourself inside. Take some exaggerated breaths, some deep breaths. You can inhale and hold it. And release it slowly. Do that 3 or 4 times, settling in again. And just noticing the play of life. Sounds. And sensations. Sounds and sensations arise and pass out of the vast field of awareness. Sensations. No arms, no legs, no feet, no head, just points of sensation, like stars in the night sky. The dance of life. Thoughts, sounds, sensations, all arise and pass in the open field of awareness. Now look directly at the nature of awareness. Awareness is empty, vast, transparent, unstained, vivid, awareness is the knowing presence for the play of all phenomena, but is not made of them. Awareness is the knowing presence of the play of all phenomena, but is not made of them. Look directly at the nature of awareness. Intrinsically empty, radiant, illumined, look directly at the nature of awareness. Empty of self, yet ceaselessly responsive to all situations. Awake and responsive, knowing. Look directly at the nature of awareness. Sounds, sensations, thoughts, emotions all arise and pass in the open field of awareness. So you can open your eyes or keep them closed if you wish. So in the reflection, there was a pointing toward the absence of a self-centeredness. Just awareness, knowing the rising and passing of phenomena. Essentially, nature knowing itself. So maybe you've had some moments of that experience as you practice this week. That reflection is just a pointing. So the question for us all, are we that node in Indra's net, that activity known as whatever our name is, that jewel that realizes the connection with all of creation? Are you that node? And it's natural. You fall into self-centeredness. It's okay. It's okay. It's natural. It's like gravity. When this self-centered reference point kind of contracts around itself and gets activated, kind of circling around tighter and tighter, it feels like we get shut in. Our worries, our hopes, fears, plans. Everything gets referenced from a narrower and narrower place. It just happens. You lose perspective. Mindfulness escapes. And then it's as if the whole life revolves around the getting the next desire satisfied, whatever it might be. The new thing, the new experience, getting that person, or getting rid of the other end of the stickiness, getting rid of that thing, that experience that you don't like, that unpleasant thing, or the person. With the delusional thought that if that all happens, then happiness will be yours forever. And so it's that wheel of samsara. But the great beauty of this practice, we begin to see the futility of that. And we see it over and over. And we're still humans. Over and over, we get pulled in to that gravitational field of self. That kind of centering orbit, and we find ourselves trying to gratify it, defend it, protect it, fulfill it. But through mindfulness, through this patient, kindly attention and investigation of your hearts and minds, can penetrate into those subtle aspects of experience. And from that base, you get a glimpse of the empty nature of self. And you start to get a visceral sense of the Buddha's most basic instruction to us. Most basic. Nothing whatsoever is to be clung to as I or mine. Nothing whatsoever is to be clung to as I or mine. That is the source of so much suffering and agony, destruction. And so in time, you do get to experience some moments where that confining gravitational pull of the ego-centeredness lightens up. And it feels like there's more air, there's spaciousness, there's a freshness. It's like you're released. You take flight. There is no gravity. It's like you're born, reborn. Hallelujah, brothers and sisters. Those moments that happen. This poem by Rilke speaks to that. So you might just close your eyes and imagine this. Center of all centers, core of cores, almond, self-enclosed, and growing sweet. All this universe, to the furthest stars, all beyond them, is your flesh, your fruit. Now you feel how nothing clings to you. Your vast shell reaches into endless space. And there the rich, thick fluids rise and flow, illuminated in your infinite peace. A billion stars go spinning through the night, blazing high above your head. But in you is the presence that will be when all the stars are dead. So we begin to glimpse this radiance of mind, this boundless, clear, unconstrained. Have you ever had time around people that you know, or teachers, or someone where they feel kind of empty in that way? Not dull, but empty in that expansive way. I've reflected a lot on the time that for some reason Bhante Gunaratana came to my house for 3 days. And part of it was R&R from the monastery. They felt he was overworking himself. He was approaching 80. He's from Sri Lanka, those of you that don't know him. And he's been a monk since age 11. It's a lot of meditation, 70-some years. So while he's at my house, he would get up early every morning, like at 3 o'clock. He'd meditate for 3 hours. Then he'd work on his books, and he was writing 4 books at once. He'd sit on his zafu, and he'd be typing away on his computer and working on one and working on another. He'd say, I get tired of one, and I work on the other one. And we'd go for these walks. We'd take my dogs, and we'd go for these long walks. And he liked walking on the hills. We'd go on these 5-6 mile walks. And he enjoyed the dogs, enjoyed all the nature. We just have these conversations. Sometimes we talk about Dharma stuff, and sometimes we're just kind of marveling at stuff. And after a while, after a couple of days of this, I was feeling a little high, a little stoned, kind of, just hanging around this short little guy. And it dawned on me that I was kind of drafting into his space, to use a NASCAR term. Somehow this space of emptiness, empty of self. It's this field that he has around him. And he's really he's a world treasure, in a way. It's very inspiring. Makes me smile when I think about the whole experience. Mother Teresa was asked, what do you say to God when you pray? She said, I don't say anything, she replied. I just listen. And then the interviewer asked, well, what does God say to you? And she said, He doesn't say anything. He just listens. And if you don't understand that, I can't explain it to you. So there she is, quiet, listening to listening, but resting in the emptiness of self. Open, awake, very sweet. And from the Buddha, in what is seen, there should be just the seen. In what is heard, there should be just the heard. In what is sensed, there should be just the sensed. In what is thought, there should be just the thought. It's just that simple. Awareness, knowing, activity. Just the knowing without the overlay of all the constructs. Open, empty. From Rumi, live in the nowhere that you come from, even though you have an address here. Live in the nowhere that you come from, even though you have an address here. That's the very rich, beautiful paradox of practice. To come to know the nowhere that we come from, even though we're really having our feet on the ground with greater and greater mindfulness. Right here, right now, in the midst of all the relationships, the busyness, all the mashugana. See, I'm learning to speak Yiddish. When you get a real good feel for and a taste of the interdependence, when you become experienced in that taste, Jimi Hendrix always used to say, are you experienced? I think this is what he was talking about. And actually, if you think about the experience of hallucinogenics, those of you that might have read about it somewhere, I've been told that there's this kind of feeling of absolute non-separation and oneness. So, that experience, that experiencing that intrinsic emptiness of self, experiencing that interdependence, what's interesting is compassion arises spontaneously out of the emptiness. It's a natural response of this wisdom, heart, mind. That when we see and feel the connectedness to everything, no me, no you, no boundary, no inner, no outer, there's compassion that arises. And compassion is an amazing human characteristic. Someone in a meeting asked me, well, is empathy the same as compassion? And actually, compassion's a lot more. Empathy is beautiful in itself. That's basically the feeling for another person's difficulty. But compassion, definition I like the most is the quivering of the heart in response to suffering. There's an action there. It's a verb. Compassion is a verb. There's a motivation to do something, to reach out. What can I do to help? How can I help you work with this? That stirring of the heart is that relative bodhicitta. This from Norman Fisher, the Zen teacher. We have all sorts of needs and we can pile them up. When self-concern is our major motivation, it requires a high level of cooperation from the world, and it just doesn't work like that. When the light of bodhicitta goes off, the whole perspective changes. It broadens. We see how much happier it is to be expansive and to be concerned for others. And when we look into the nature of self, we see that we are the other. Now with bodhicitta, under self-concern, when bad things happen, under self-concern, when bad things happen, there is a tight anguish. Under bodhicitta, the picture widens out, and we have a whole different set of concerns. And even when bodhicitta sees suffering in the world and takes it in, there is still room for joy. There is sorrow, but because of the expansive perspective, there is room for joy. It is not narrow. Bodhicitta allows for it all. Awareness can hold everything, joy, sorrow, at the same time. Think of the Dalai Lama, 50-some years in exile, struggling mostly completely unsuccessfully for the rights of his people in Tibet. But his capacity to keep his heart open in the face of that, year after year, decade after decade, it's legendary. He says this: whenever I meet people, I always approach them from the standpoint of the most basic things we have in common. We each have a physical structure, a mind, emotions. We are all born in the same way and we all die. All of us want happiness and do not want to suffer. Looking at others from this standpoint, rather than emphasizing secondary differences such as the fact that I am Tibetan or a different color or religion or cultural background, allows me to have a feeling that I'm meeting someone just the same as me. I find that relating to others on that level makes it much easier to exchange and communicate. Tremendous bodhicitta with the Dalai Lama. Just such open-heartedness. And there's many high-profile examples of bodhicitta. Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Rosa Parks, many of them. But normally it's not played out under the spotlight of international events like that. Mostly it's more lower key. A story. As the old man walked the beach at dawn, he noticed a youth ahead of him picking up starfish and flinging them into the sea. Finally catching up with the youth, he asked him why he was doing this. The answer was that the stranded starfish would die if it was left out in the morning sun. But the beach goes on for miles and there are millions of starfish, countered the old man. How can your effort make any difference? The young man looked at the starfish in his hand, then threw it in the safety of the waves. It makes a big difference to this one, he said. So the expression of bodhicitta takes many ordinary and beautiful forms in sometimes surprising ways. From regular people, fearful people, wounded people. This energy exists. It's there all the time, and sometimes it's covered over. It's really the hope of humanity. I'd like to tell a story about my father. he really didn't have a father. He was the last of 13 children who were born to an Irish immigrant. His father died when he was 2. None of my uncles or aunts had anything more than a grade school education. I think my father made it through grade 3. Time goes forward. World War II starts. He enlists. He serves with the 5th Army. They still have the record for the most consecutive days in combat. It was almost 700 days. So he comes home from World War II. Classic PTSD. My relatives would say, oh, he's a little shell-shocked. But along with that came impatience, a violent temper. You know, there's a lot of, I can go on and on with stories about him, but when he was asleep, we had to be careful, especially my mother. She was really good at this. That if you touched him to wake him, like on one shoulder, if you touched him on this shoulder, he'd come in that direction with a left cross, right out of a sound sleep. So you had to move. My mother was great at kind of ducking punches. So I'm about 16 and I'm home and I think it's late spring, kind of this kind of weather I remember. And we lived in a little row house in Bloomfield, New Jersey, and it was there were 2 floors, about 400 square feet on each floor, really tiny, with a wall between the next row house that was paper thin. You knew everything that was going on there. They knew everything that was going on. And next door to me, and we lived on the corner row house, and there was a whole bunch of them, was a person that had some notoriety. He was the president of the North Jersey Aliens Motorcycle Club, who occasionally lived with his parents there. And the aliens were pretty powerful. They had actually pushed the Hells Angels out of the North Jersey at that time. And they had recently been busted, and their clubhouse, which was in Patterson, was closed down. So they were having their meetings, their gang meetings, right outside our house. And we were on the end. So they'd park all their bikes there. They'd be drinking beer and working on their bikes and just, having a good time, rowdy. And so Jersey Jack, as he was known, was the president. He lived next door. Big guy. And had tattoos before they were popular. I mean, only Navy people had tattoos back then. But he did. And so I'm just inside and this ruckus is going on. My father looks outside. He goes, those SOBs. And I looked and I could see he was going off. So he goes, he goes rushing off. And what was happening, these guys are drinking a lot of beer. So they were urinating on our property, on the fence. That was bad. So my father, a little spit of a guy, comes right in the middle of them. And he's reading the riot act. And I get up and I'm like frozen, like, what am I going to do? He's going to get killed, So I stand by the door. I'm kind of like, I grab a baseball bat and I have it behind me. And he's out there and they're closing in on him. And finally, Jack comes and steps in and he goes, gee, sorry, Mr. Coffey, really sorry about this. And then he turned to his guys and said, well, you're sorry about this too, right? And they said, well, yeah, we're sorry. And then somehow they diverted my father to look at a motorcycle. They had new chrome and this and that. Some great old Indians, if you know anything about motorcycles, they're treasures. So next thing you know, I'm relieved. I just sat down, wiped the sweat off my brow. He comes in, and a few moments later, he's got like 2 toolboxes. He's dragging it out into the street, and he's helping these guys with their motorcycles, sharing his tools, and they're all hanging out together, and he's drinking a beer, and it's like, so as damaged and wounded a person as he was, there's that kind of goodness, that wanting to help, even in a difficult situation. It somehow came through. And I saw that over and over. I get all kinds of stories. Time he bought a monkey home from the factory he was working at because some guy said he was going to have it put down. That's another story. My mother loved that. But I was king of the neighborhood, believe me. So we don't have to be anything special to practice bodhicitta in the world. Really. Our coworkers, our neighbors, everybody we encounter, we have that opportunity. This from Sister Joan Chittister. This is her special compassion practice. She says, try saying this silently to everyone and everything you see for 30 days. I wish you happiness now, and whatever will bring you happiness will bring happiness to you in the future. If we said it to the sky, we would have to stop polluting. If we said it when we see ponds and lakes and streams, we would have to stop using them as garbage dumps and sewers. If we said it to small children, we would have to stop abusing them, even in the name of training. If we said it to people, we would have to stop stoking the fires of enmity around us. Beauty and human warmth would take root in us like a clear, hot June day. We would change. I wish you happiness now and whatever will bring happiness to you in the future. It said that when both the relative and absolute bodhicitta presents, when they're alive, that is compassion and emptiness, enlightenment is unavoidable. So the practice of loving kindness and compassion, they're not lofty ideals. This energy of the awakened heart-mind is within all of us. We don't have to create it from scratch. And yeah, sometimes it gets all covered over. We get scared and fearful and whatever. But the potential is there. It's inherent. And if you can cultivate it just a little bit, it becomes more and more available. Even during the times where it feels like things are stacked against you, you're feeling a little lost and helpless. If you can take the time to look, allow that sacred pause, you can find your love again. You can find your kindness again. It's always there. It's just a pause and a relaxation away. One breath. So let's just sit together for a moment. This is from Whitman's Song of the Open Road. I inhale great draughts of space. The east and the west are mine, and the north and the south are mine. I am larger, better than I thought. I did not know I held so much goodness. I am larger, better than I thought. I did not know I held so much goodness. Thank you for your attention. And this evening, I think I will recite the Metta Sutta, kind of pull together the evening. So, time for walking and enjoying the expanse of this cosmos. And we'll reconvene in about 25 minutes.